I'm going to repeat just quickly that we made an announcement about the validators. I posted in a chat. So we are having Daniel now to talk more about the validator ecosystem, and I also mentioned that we are having lots of events all around the world. So please check our Discord calendar and also the announcement um, to find out. Probably there's going to be something nearby you. So Daniel, stage is yours now. Maybe you can introduce yourself, take your time, maybe 10, 15 minutes to present, and then let's leave another 10 minutes for questions, because I know that our community has some questions about validators, about the process. So that's going to be nice to have time for questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd love to get to know like where everyone is listening in from. But a little bit about myself. Yeah, Nadari said I'm helping manage the validator ecosystem, and then we'll be helping a bit with provers as well. For those of you guys are all probably pretty aware of like these different infrastructure service provider types between these. So we have like the POW style prover, ZK prover, infrastructure service provider participants that we're really excited to see in the Aleo ecosystem, of which Aleo had been POSW solely, where both consensus and the proving would be done by a single entity, the ZK prover. But now, obviously, as of earlier this year, Aleo has elected to have consensus be done by POS system, which is Bullshark, which requires a need for validators. And we've seen the validator ecosystem grow and evolve these past few years. So yeah, it's exciting. Bit about myself. Let's see. Specifically to Aleo, so I actually used to study cryptography in grad school, and my research for a few years had been in distributed systems. But specific to Aleo, my advisor actually in grad school, I went to Hopkins, was Matt Green, and Matt Green was one of the co-authors to the Zero Coin protocol research paper that eventually became Zcash. And while actually I was still in grad school and Matt was advising me, he co-authored and published the Zexi paper, Zero Knowledge Execution, of which Howard Wu was one of the co-authors. And right now we have Aleo. So I've known about Aleo and the team for quite some time. I actually almost joined Aleo in end of 2020. But at that point in time, I had I had elected to go to a validator instead. My sort of like my journey in the blockchain infrastructure space has been um, it's been quite a long time. I've had more a longer tenure in the POW ecosystem. I had actually um, the reason I got into crypto and blockchain was because I started off as a Bitcoin miner in 2000, at the end of 2013. I'd actually worked at a law firm, this law firm called Wilmer Hale. I'm probably aging myself here, but if you guys all remember, in 2012, the U.S. government um, was suing HSBC because HSBC had been engaged in money laundering and terrorist financing, and I had actually rage quit that law firm. And don't quote me on this, but like, I was like saying like, I want to burn down all the banks. And my friend actually had approached me and said, "Hey, Daniel, I know you hate banks. We're going to replace the banks with Bitcoin." Um, and so that's how I got into just being heavily involved with like the Bitcoin infrastructure miners side of things. And then I'd done a lot of things in between. I'd done work with permission blockchains like Hyperledger Fabric, in supply chain sample management processes at Genentech. Um, I worked a lot with cluster computing at a bioinformatics lab at University of Maryland, and kind of got really into distributed systems there. And then my research was specifically on distributed systems within the Information Security Institute at Johns Hopkins, where my coursework was primarily in cryptography, where I got to work with Matt Green and who advised my thesis. But I'd done everything from ecosystem development. I was building hyperlocalized decentralized exchanges in Korea and Japan if you guys remember 0x protocol, from 0x protocol, they gave me quite a large sum of money to do that. And then eventually found my way into working at Steakfish. That there's actually a longer and more interesting story of how I got into the validator ecosystem. But I'll say that for another time, maybe on like a water cooler talk or something. So I basically joined Steakfish and led their protocols team. And so Steakfish, if you guys know, it was the largest non-custodial Ethereum validator, the largest validator in Cosmos, and the sister company F2Pool, which I was more familiar with, where I led special projects as well, was the largest Bitcoin mining pool in the world, and the second largest for Ethereum when it was still POW. And actually, that experience working there was probably a good idea because I ended up getting that experience working there instead of joining Aleo so early. And then now Aleo's is now POS and POW, and it's on the verge of launching its mainnet, and the testnet's coming up in October. And it's the perfect sort of fit for me to help continue contributing to the Aleo ecosystem. But while I was at the POS sort of side of things at Steakfish, I basically, alongside Victor Bunin from Bison Trails, which is now acquired by Coinbase and is labeled Coinbase Cloud, he and I basically started the very first validator meetup. And we had both coined the term protocol specialist together a couple of years ago at Mainnet Masari side event that we had hosted. And then I started I set up a validator working group called Validator Commons about 2 years ago, and led those working groups. And then, so a lot of my efforts have been in the validator ecosystem in general to help sort of mature the ecosystem from a standards, classification, self-regulatory perspective. Yeah, and then sort of got the opportunity, obviously, at Aleo to help guide its validator ecosystem. And along with that comes the testnet ecosystem, as well as what we're going to be gearing towards for mainnet. I do actually have quite a passionate spiel I'd like to share about sort of like the direction of how these blockchain ecosystems like Aleo can really establish strong foundations for its resiliency and robustness in the future. But maybe we can talk about that a little later maybe from Nodari has some questions about that. Sorry that got so long, but that's kind of a bit of my I guess almost, yeah, a little over 10-year journey in the infrastructure space and ecosystem, and sort of like my background as the engineering side, and my sort of like unique story and connection to Aleo. I don't know. Fun fact is I had actually studied plant biology in college, and I actually did a second undergrad in computer science and studied voodoo as part of my religion major also when I was studying biology. So I know some really weird random facts in that area. Okay, I'll stop there. Sorry, Nadari, that got so long, but yeah, happy. I don't know how we're gonna do this, but if you have questions, I have questions. I can talk a little bit about the selection process that I had obviously written a bit of in the validator announcements channel that I think everyone has read access to. But yeah, maybe Nadara, you want to take it away, or?
Yep. Thanks, Daniel, for sharing about yourself. And let's maybe talk a little bit about the process. We have some questions, definitely, but yeah, maybe for a few minutes, just talk about the process, how the process will be during the testnet, and how the process will be during the mainnet. So yeah, just to differentiate the testnet validators and the mainnet validators.
Yeah, sure. So I think something to be very clear of is that testnet will not determine permanently like who the mainnet validators are. I think a lot of other ecosystems, other L1s that have launched as POS had done something like that. And it probably does kind of color sort of like what from the Aleo side they do know about other validators. But testnet is really an important way of being able to gather data, especially right. Testnet is like the cusp of how we start to get to what our mainnet can look like and iron out all the kinks. And then especially right with the auditors that we are working with. So I think that's probably a lot of what people had questions of, right? Testnet valid being selected as a testnet validator is not like a permanent role in mainnet validator as a mainnet validator. Mainnet validators are going to be required to have a certain minimum number of Aleo credits, aka the token, Aleo token, staked, and to be an Aleo mainnet validator. And so that minimum number, I think we will release soon enough. I think maybe some people had seen some numbers floating around out there. But there's going to be a minimum number of Aleo tokens, or sorry, we call them Aleo credits, saved to the validator that will determine you as a validator status on mainnet. That number will be released soon. Another is that, and under that umbrella is Aleo. It's not a self-bonding requirement. So I don't know how familiar most of you guys are with those terms, but self-bonding means sort of like a validator has to have its own owned Aleo credits or credit tokens that needs a stake. So basically, again, what that means is the total amount of Aleo tokens or Aleo credits are need to fulfill that equal amount. So for let's say, for example, you're a validator and you have no Aleo tokens at all. None of your team has any at all. But if some people from the Aleo ecosystem in aggregate stake the minimum amount to your validator, that's fulfilled. You as a validator team don't have to own that number of Aleo credits. So that's one thing. The data part is right. And sorry. And just to continue on that vein, when mainnet comes, there obviously will be right. We can think of for the minimum Aleo credit, like sort of 3 or 3.5 areas where Aleo credits can come from for that validators are going to be seeking, right? Because the validator game is right. You need to get credits and stake it, and then you can right help provide obviously security to the network, but you get rewarded for providing that type of security to the network. So, and this is probably I think I saw a few validators here in the chat, in the audience. There's like 3.5 ways that Aleo credits flow in. So one is obviously right investors. Aleo investors have are going to have Aleo credits, obviously. And so they, right, when mainnet launches at the token generation event, aka the TG event, TG, they have to basically do something, right? They can hold their credits in their wallet or they can stake it, right? And so that is one very big source of where Aleo credits are going to come from. And then that's where the validators can potentially be able to get credits from to stake with them. The second is, as we know, right, the prover ecosystem. There's basically two infrastructure service provider types in the Aleo ecosystem, right, that we talked about a little earlier. Aleo ZK provers and then Aleo mainnet validators, right? And so Aleo mainnet validators are basically going to have like a pretty constant reward generation rate, right? Like the rewards for blocks are going to be consistent. However, Aleo ZK provers are going to start at a much higher reward rate for providing their proving services over time. And that is, going to start very high, and then over 10 years, it's going to go lower. So then that means basically, from a time perspective, the number of Aleo credits that are also going to be abundant is going to come from ZK provers. So, right, the first was Aleo investors who hold tokens. The second is ZK provers. The third is, right, foundation delegations. And the Aleo Foundation is going to have a certain number of credits that needs to help catalyze and kickstart this ecosystem. And that is where we're going to be able to see, right, what I would like to call like the fill in the gaps part. Because let's say there's this, the ecosystem is the board, and then mainnet launches, and we have obviously not much control over like what's going to happen on mainnet, right? Because it's permissionless, right? All the pieces are going to be scattered on the board, and we're going to see what those pieces look like from a variety of perspectives. And I'll just choose one very specific. Obviously, this is not the whole thing, but one, like let's imagine, for example, geographic decentralization metrics. And so, right, mainnet launches, permissionless setting, and then right, we begin to see how the stake or how stake is distributed across validators geographically in the world, right? And this is like could be jurisdictional and also node location. And so let's say, for example, right, 90% of the Aleo network is, staked with Northwestern validators, right? The West, validators in the West. And so, right, that's obviously not very geographically decentralized, and which also probably means that your infrastructure is not geographically decentralized, which brings up questions of infrastructure robustness and resilience. And so, right, part of the foundation's role is one of the foundation's roles is to like help sort of fill in those gaps where, okay, we can start to spread out some of the foundation delegations to areas in the world that are quite important to kind of, pull it away just and then have like more representation in the east or the south, etc. And the reason that's so important and that foundation's role is so important in the beginning and early days is because, from like an infrastructure perspective, I don't know how familiar you guys are with that, is that you get this sort of like black hole gravity well sort of like phenomena. And what I mean by that is on the topic and umbrella of sort of geographic infrastructure decentralization is that, right, if there's just one cluster geographically that has all the nodes running there, then it becomes very difficult for, let's say, other nodes or validators outside of that cluster. Let's say all the nodes are clustered in, US East. And then if a validator out in like Thailand or something, right, they're not going to be able to find peers from an infrastructure perspective if they're hosting their node in Thailand. And then they're going to miss consensus or they're going to miss blocks. And so they're going to have to, right, eventually run their infrastructure through cloud, probably, if they're a team based in Thailand. out in US East, in Northeastern America, which is right not what we want. Um, and so it's right, the longer you leave a gravity well or a black hole, the stronger and stronger that cluster becomes. And so I think, especially in the early days, it's very important to have like this focus on ensuring that there is enough sort of like when you scatter the pieces on this board, geographically speaking, that there are enough like clusters all around the world. That's doesn't have to be completely evenly distributed, but I hope you get my point. And so that I think, and then the 0.5 place where the tokens can come from, right? The first was Aleo investors. The second is Aleo ZK provers. The third is foundation delegations. Is also through like grants. So like, and I specifically had separated those two, right? Because like foundation delegations are very different from grants because the foundation delegations come to fill those gaps, but the grants, ecosystem grants, which is like a separate pile of Aleo credits, are specifically used to support validators, right? And for those of you who are not as familiar with the validator ecosystem, specifically the professional validator ecosystem, is right. A lot of these validators provide very foundational tooling to the ecosystem, right? These can be everywhere from RPC nodes to block explorers to wallets to like tooling to cron tooling, right? All the different sort of like tools that might be hidden away from the retail ecosystem, but it's quite critical for the developer ecosystem to flourish. And so, right, those grants, right, where like validators, right, we obviously have a large, wide spectrum of validators, which I can get into as well. And that spectrum of validators can include like people who are specialized at regional meetings, people who are specialized at tooling, people specialized at dashboards or um, of that sort. And so, right, through grants, through ecosystem grants, where like these validators, which are, most usually have very, very talented DevOps teams and software engineering teams, and who have been running this validators for a couple of years now, right? They can exhibit their very special core competencies in like saying, hey, right, we can maintain a very efficient and effective RPC endpoint. You'll apply for a grant from Aleo Foundation, and then get a bunch of credits that maybe can fill in the gap to hit that minimum requirement for being an Aleo validator, right? And so those are like the 3.5, 3.5 sort of sources of where Aleo credits can come from. And what we'll be likely doing is, right, each of those three entities, right, like the 1.5 entities, the foundation, each of those three entities, what we'll be doing is specifically because we don't want just like the usual suspect validators to always be like the ones that are getting all the stake. And that obviously happens for a reason, right? Because people don't know smaller validators, they only know the big ones, right? And then just like trust that. Is that we'll be doing like sort of like these meet and greet sort of speed dating kind of thing. So that will be open to everyone. And what I mean by that is that, right, so Aleo investors have credits that they need to stake. They're going to have to choose a validator. We'll be giving an opportunity for the validator ecosystem and the testnet validators and then other validators that have not been selected in testnet, who still also exist as as professional operators. They'll get a chance to meet some of the Aleo investors and say basically like saying, hey, this is like a fair, right? Like you have to show how competent you are and how worthy you are, basically. And that worthiness or competency is obviously something that had been part of the Aleo testnet validator selection process, so that Google form that we had all put out. And actually, I'm pretty confident in saying that, especially coming from a validator operator in a previous life before, It's probably the most comprehensive validator onboarding selection process that I've ever seen. Obviously, because I wrote it, and because I've seen so many networks and onboarded so many networks in my previous role as the head of protocols at Snakefish. Right, it really gave us a very thorough and comprehensive look into a lot of those different metrics that we had assessed for choosing validators, and then making sure that we can sort of simulate the ideal scenario of what a truly decentralized, from all levels of infrastructure decentralization, operator decentralization, etc., that the testnet could look like. So the same thing we'll be doing for investors. We can also do the same thing. We're doing the same thing for validators to also be the ZK provers, because that's going to be coming from that's going to be another token, emission sort of like source pool. And then also like giving an opportunity for validators also to apply for foundation delegations from the foundation as well. So those are like the three sources that will have the opportunity for validators to meet and greet. You can think of a speed dating or like a fair kind of concept. And I
Thanks.
can go to. Oh, sorry, Nidar. Go ahead.
Thanks, Daniel, for explanation. Just to clarify, there are going to be set of requirements once the mainnet is launched. So anyone who meets these requirements can become validator. Is that correct?
Not completely correct. You have to have a minimum number of Aleo credits staked with you to be considered an active mainnet validator. There's these sources of where these credits can come from. The validators are going to have to do their business development efforts to get some of those credits. We'll be supporting that process of validators being able to know where those credits come from, right? Foundation delegations, after application, ZK provers, like you have to know who the ZK provers are, so we'll help you meet and greet some of the provers so you can get some of those tokens, and then also investors.
And the minimum of the tokens, the credit requirements will be determined later, right? After the testnet validators.
Yeah, we will announce that officially. It's basically right the same question of is the algorithm for proving going to change, right? Nothing is final until mainnet comes. So
great. And another question is, how many validators are we going to have during the testnet phase?
Yeah, it's 55. And the mainnet validators, but based on I don't know how many people here are familiar with bull shark consensus, but it's going to allow for more than 150 or so validators. For people who are familiar with the Cosmos ecosystem, right? There's like basically an arbitrary cutoff point for what is an active and inactive validator, but for this you can have over 150 validators.
Great, thanks. And the question I also saw getting is there still possibility to join testnet validator phase?
No. We've selected. We've selected the 55, and I can go into how we selected them. So as I said, this is probably I'm pretty confident in saying that this was probably the most comprehensive selection process that I've ever seen in any L1 ecosystem. And then I wrote it as such because I used to operate a validator, and these were some of the things that were important. But what I could basically go through is, and obviously this was all information that is in the validator announcements channel as well. But right, some of the things that we looked at was how long have these validators been involved in the Aleo community, right? Were they also running infrastructure? What type of infrastructure type are they using, right? And so, right, this is like bare metal, data centers, co-location, cloud, and also just to make it clear, I literally went through 6,000 applications. I looked at every single one. And yeah, it was a lot of work, but I wanted to make it very clear that I did look at every single application when we're doing the selection process. I didn't just go and choose randomly. It was a lot of work, um, but I grinded through it. And yeah, I mean, a lot of those submissions were just people who had no business running validators because they didn't even know how to answer the questions. But and yeah, so I didn't miss anything. I went through every single submission. Um, so other parts that we looked at were like jurisdiction types, and like what jurisdictions that validator teams are based in. Because for those of you who have been active in like sort of like the validator ecosystem at the infrastructure layer, right? There's very big difference between a node, an ecosystem's node location, and an ecosystem's team, a validator team location. So, for example, right, you see some of these L1s that launch and they show you like this global map of the world, and they're like, "Oh, cool, there's this map," and then they show you all these like little hotspots of like little light hotspots of like saying, "Hey, we have nodes all around the world," right? And you see it's like nice and distributed. Um, but the reality is, if you look under the hood, um, is that it's maybe like a North American validator that's running nodes in Asia, and there's actually no team in Asia, which is very different from a team in Asia running nodes in Asia. Um, and so, right, that the underlying assumptions of nodes in Asia means, right, we can go down this logical sequence of, right, node in Asia, the assumption is there's a team in Asia, which means there's an assumption that that team in Asia can engage with the local ecosystem in Asia, and that local ecosystem in Asia can aid in BD in Asia for the team, for Aleo, and that local BD can help grow the ecosystem there, right? Those like hotspots that you can create. And so that's why jurisdiction type is quite important that we looked at. And I wanted to make sure that, right, in an ideal world, there's like this sort of geographic decentralization of um, validator team jurisdiction locations versus random versus just nodes. So, right, obviously, we asked for node location and also jurisdictional location. Another thing that we assessed on was, and this is probably one of the more important things, specifically for our engineering team at Aleo, is how many other networks that these validators, testnet validators have run. And the important part of running it, of experience, and especially a broad range of experience, is that, right, as validator operators, you get to run very different networks. And those different networks have a different set of problems. And so, right, you can say, and then this is just me putting my validator hat on, the validator ecosystem has seen, right, validator operators have seen networks rise and fall, right? Like there have been very different types of networks go up and down. Um, and they have the experience that they get to see in a lot of other things that they can share. And so having a breadth of differentiated networks that validators have already operated on was very important because you have that type of wisdom. A really good example that I can provide is, for example, Solana. In the Solana ecosystem, there was this new concept called stake pools, which had certain like issues that had been created because of stake pools' attempt at solving a problem. And so the Solana validators, and I actually hosted a workshop specifically on stake pools at a Breakpoint a few years ago, where like the foundation director came, et cetera, et cetera. And we discussed it and we helped resolve it. But right, I was also sitting on the near validator advisory board for Stakefish. And when the near validator advisory board, this is like sort of like the staging area for the near ecosystem to engage in more products for the validator ecosystem. The near ecosystem was about to do the same exact thing that the Solana ecosystem had done. And right, this was like a very classic case of ecosystems having these blinders on, where they were only looking at their own thing and not looking at other historical examples that have been around. And so what this gave validators in the near validator advisory board to look at what say do was they're like, hey, we also run Solana validators and we've seen this exact same concept happen in the Solana ecosystem. Let us tell you, right, what worked and what didn't work. And so that obviously saved a lot of time, right? There was no need to recreate a wheel and see that the wheel is broken and fix it, because these validators had been multi-chain validators and seen a lot of really good examples or bad examples in the solutions there. And so, right, the um, the the experience that existing validators had on other ecosystems and private ecosystems was really important. And obviously, we also looked at like how well those validators from a performance perspective also um, performed on those, right? And the way we did that was we literally asked, and again, right, like a lot of work on my end, but right, we literally asked for each of those validators addresses on other networks so that we can take a look at how their performance was doing on those networks and how they moved up the ranks or didn't, and like correlate that. So we had to go and look at every single validator on, and then how they did on those different networks, and that was like the point of assessment. Um, the other was, oh, sorry, go ahead, Udai.
Sorry to interrupt because we're over time, like 10 minutes, but I want to
Oh,
ask the
I'm so sorry.
last question. That's totally fine. Thank you so much for the explanations. The one last question is that
Oh, can I
the
quickly go do a TLDR for the other ones?
sorry?
Yeah, I can, I'll take like 1 minute to go through the other ones and people before I answer your
Sure,
question.
absolutely. Yeah, go
Yeah, so the other one was like, have you also participated in the test nets? Have you done like some of the other ecosystem stuff? Right. Some things was like social presence. We talked about we investigated like failover protocol, like internal validator operations, and like how mature you as a validator operator were, and these included like failover protocols. Like some people didn't even know what a failover protocol was, which was right grounds for elimination, because like this is a really important part of securing the network. The geographic node selection rationale, how they engage with delegators from a retail perspective, from an institutional perspective, how they thought about general governance and indirect, direct, on chain, like what their reasons were, how they were enthusiastic about Aleo, how they heard about it, their community participation, what they were going to contribute to the ecosystem, and what kind of tools. And so, right, this is very comprehensive, and we went on. Okay, sorry, but I just wanted to finish up those, make sure everyone got
Absolutely,
that.
no worries at all. The last question is like, what requirements should we expect for the mainnet validator rather than the minimum credits you need to have? Is there any other requirements you can share it right now? And when these
Yeah,
requirements will be determined, like before the mainnet, like shortly before the mainnet, or like when?
yeah. What we can also do, we have like a GitHub repo that lists the requirements for Snark OS, which is what validators are going to be required to run. And so they have like a general list of recommendations for hardware there. But obviously, right, like the danger of like a foundation saying like this is the hardware requirements, um, right? It's too prescriptive, and what I mean prescriptive is right, We it's very healthy to have a diversity of how validators do set up, right? From right infrastructure type. And so if we say, hey, this is the hardware requirements that we have used running cloud, then that's not stop talking about bare metal, right? But like obviously we want a mixture of infrastructure. So, but on the GitHub repo, there is like examples, and this is not the only way, but examples of like, how to set up these nodes. But minimum requirements, hardware requirements are obviously a default. Is there? So
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your time. I know it's pretty late for you now, so thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing and answering questions about validators, and thanks everyone to stay a little bit longer than we usually do. So today we are going to have also the engineering office hours. So any more questions you have about specifically about your applications or any other tech questions, please join us, and our engineers gonna answer your questions there. Thank you.
oh, it
Bye.
looked like there was someone named Richard that said, "Will a delegation program for values be available for the?" Yeah, so there will be for mainnet. Foundation will also have foundation delegations, and then you can also get grants as a validator operator to like run RPC node, and then that can come in obviously tokens, and then if you get enough tokens, then you can have the minimum fill the minimum. But
Cool.
yeah,
That was the question from Richard. So here's the answer. Thanks, Daniel,
yeah,
again, and thanks everyone for staying a little bit longer. Bye bye.
yeah. Nice to meet you all. Bye.